Good morning, everyone. Greetings from New York. My name is Taina Bieneme, and I am the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Welcome to our third global webinar on our series at the Voice of the Margin, looking at the effects of COVID-19 on women and girls, especially women and girls in the sex trade. So today it's a great honor for us to welcome four outstanding experts in their fields who will share their work and lived experiences on combating human trafficking, sexual violence, sexual exploitation of women and girls, especially women and girls of color in the United States and around the world. So today there are burning issues, especially here in the United States. We are talking about police brutality, prison abolition, defunding the police, all within the frameworks of systems of oppression based on race. Unfortunately, we are still not examining our systems that are based on misogyny and on the very system that under which we all live, and that is the system of patriarchy. Many of us who have been colonized by the Europeans, this is a particular conversation of interest into how the impact of colonization, slavery, imperialism have impacted our current political, socioeconomic, and cultural system. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you our panelists, starting with Yasmin Vafa, who is the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. Melanie Thompson, who is a survivor leader and who will talk about her own experiences with police brutality and what the role of the police is in protecting women and girls in the sex trade. And we're also pleased to let you know that she is the youth coordinator of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. And it's a great honor to welcome the Honorable Ambassador Per-Anders Sunesson, the Swedish ambassador at large for combating trafficking in persons, and last but certainly not least, Jonathan Mackler, who is the Administration and Development Officer at CAP International. So let me start with you, Yasmin, since Rights for Girls and you in particular have done tremendous work, groundbreaking work on the pipeline to prison of young girls of color, especially Black and brown girls. And what are you seeing on the ground now, and what are your findings?
Based on the work that we've done on behalf of and with young women and girls of color, and in DC, predominantly Black girls and young women, it's very clear that our young girls have few places where they feel safe. Whether that's in their homes, in their schools, at their jobs, ultimately in their communities. And so it's no surprise that young women and girls of color, especially Black and Indigenous girls and women, experience disproportionate rates of violence and sexual exploitation. But the survivors that we work with are very, very clear that when and if they do encounter law enforcement or try to seek justice through the system, that it's in many ways harmful and inadequate means of protecting them and providing them safety. And so some of the experiences that the young women and girls that we work with identify is that if and when police are called to intervene to circumstances of violence, they are at risk of being arrested and criminalized for their own victimization, which is a concept that we talk about at length in our work, and a concept that we refer to as the abuse to prison pipeline. And I think Mariana might have some fact sheets that she can send in the chat for folks that want to look at some of the numbers and the data that we've been able to amass over the years. But some of the other really harmful consequences of police involvement are that young women and girls of color know that if and when police are called, that they're likely to experience sexual violence, abuse at the hands of police officers themselves. They know that their loved ones, their own person, their neighbors are at risk of maybe being killed if the police are called. And the young women that we work with, even if they seek justice through our current system, are the least likely to be believed. And that's because of a whole host of, structural issues, racism, implicit biases at every level of our current system. And so it's very clear that the current system is wholly inadequate, that in many ways it's re-victimizing, re-traumatizing young women and girls of color, and particularly Black girls. And so, it's very important to realize that there is a long history of mistrust with law enforcement and the system and marginalized communities, particularly communities of color. But it's also important, as we have all of these conversations around, defunding the police, around abolition, that we are careful to make sure that whatever system that we are re-envisioning, if it's outside of the current one, have to center the needs of our most marginalized, has to center the safety and well-being of young women and children of color. Otherwise, we risk creating another system that is harmful and inadequate, and that leaves women and girls of color, and particularly Black and Indigenous women and girls, behind. And so I think these are all very important things to be considering as we, chart a new path.
Thanks, Yasmin. And that raises a critical question for you, Melanie, is here you were a sex trafficked child, you experienced severe police violence, including sexual violence, and yet did you want your pimp to go to jail?
Thanks, Diana. That's a great question. So I guess just to give a little background to those who have not seen me before, my name is Melanie. I was trafficked here in New York City when I was 12 years old and put into the sex trade, and then remained there well throughout my adult years. And I have had encounters with the police on many levels. I've had them as sex buyers. I've been arrested by police when I was put into the foster care system. I've encountered them there while I was still locked up. And I've been stopped and frisked and things alike in my adult years. And I could attest to some of the things that Yasmin was just talking about. I did want my pimp to go to jail. And I think that as we, in this current state of affairs that our state is in, talk about Black Lives Matter, the movement, as well as all of the police brutality that's happening outside of the sex trade, I think that one of the biggest questions and issues that people are talking about now is, what does police reform look like? And I think that although I personally am looking towards community policing and trying to make that shift to defund the police department and reintegrate those funds back into our community organizations to help the most marginalized, I also recognize that that's not going to happen overnight. And in the interim, while we're trying to figure that out and navigate that, we still need to bear in mind, like Yasmin was saying, our young women and girls who are being exploited in the sex trade. And community policing happening tomorrow is it's not incorporating that. So I think that while we are trying to strive towards a world where we don't have to worry about police officers and trying to navigate what defunding the police department looks like, I think that we also need to bear in mind in the interim, what's happening to girls and young women, especially Black girls and young women on the ground. So with that in mind, I think that we cannot omit accountability for those who are perpetrating the sex trade. And what that looks like right now is holding accountable pimps, traffickers, sex buyers, and all of those alike that are perpetuating the sex trade. So with that, I think that we need to, in trying to figure out what police reform is looking like, I think that we need to hold at the top of that standard those who are being affected the most, including people like me who were trafficked as children, including the adults that are being trafficked currently, and especially including all Black women, children, and everybody that's been exploited in the sex trade. So I think that we need to find a way to defund the police department while also upholding accountability for perps. And that would currently still look like putting away, locking up, arresting those who are perpetrating the sex trade. So I think that, as we have more discussion, we'll talk a little bit more about the Nordic or equality model, which is what I personally support, which does include arresting perpetrators. And I think that we need to find a way to navigate holding that accountability while still trying to ideally get to a world where we are not going to omit punishment for those who have perpetrated people like me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melanie. So when we speak to our Indigenous sisters who are in prostitution or in the movement to end sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, they will tell you that the word prostitution, the concept of prostitution, is not one that is found in their indigenous languages or in their own culture. We know that it was with the invasion of Europeans that the system of prostitution, the marketplace of women for sexual exploitation, for the perpetuation of enslaved children, comes from Europe. And so it is wonderful to have two European men or representatives of Europe who are actually involved in looking at what police reform means when it comes to sexually exploited women and girls. And so in particular, I would like to start with you, Ambassador, for you to talk about what police reform for women and girls in the sex trade looks like in Sweden, in particular with your groundbreaking 1999 law holding sex buyers accountable.
Okay, Taina, thank you so much. Well, to start with, I want to say that I've been in this office for more than 4 years now. And there is no doubt that the system of prostitution to 99.99% is depending on the existence of women and girls in vulnerable situations. No matter where I've been in the world, it's always the same. In India, the Dalits, and in other countries, the most marginalized groups. And in Europe, it's the same. Look at who's working at the brothels in Germany. 98% of the women in the brothels in Germany are women in vulnerable situations from developing countries. I also wanted to say that the practice with the police kind of varies to a certain extent, but you can say there is a common outlook. And I would say that in countries where you still have a strong patriarchy and or where the government has not taken a serious stand against a history that includes slave trade, colonialism, or a history with foreign military bases, that's where you will find the mistreatment of victims of sex trade. And on the other hand, in countries where the vision of the government is to create a society that treats all people like equals, where men and women, rich and poor, have the same rights, and this is important, where the government has broadly enacted laws that support such a vision, there I would say it's, if not yet, at least a development towards viewing and treating victims of the sex trade as victims and not criminals. And you were asking about the Swedish model, Taina. Yes. And we have had this legislation in Sweden since 1999, a legislation that only criminalized the purchase of sex, but not the person in prostitution. Instead, the authorities are obliged to offer help to those who are in prostitution to leave. And this legislation has been really successful in Sweden. It has lowered demand, and there's I would say, a good cooperation between those who still are in prostitution in Sweden and the Swedish police regarding crime investigations with human trafficking and so on. I don't know how many minutes I have, Taina, but if you want to indicate if I can go on.
Yes, please do.
So what I mean, if a country is serious about human rights and you know the facts of sex trade, there is no way that you can keep a policy such as recognizing prostitution as a job like any other job, or a policy that views the person being prostituted as criminals. It's just not possible. And I see many opportunities for a change around the world. quite a few countries are now discussing the prostitution policy and the fact that it is the most vulnerable who are serving in the prostitution industry. And this is with a lot of people in vulnerable situations seeking asylum in Europe. And a great example of ongoing discussion is our neighboring country, Germany, where there is a lot of MPs now in Germany saying we do not any longer want to be the brothel of Europe. Our legislation, which was aimed to protect those who chose to be in prostitution, it's obvious it doesn't work. It's just gotten much worse since they enacted their law. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. So in 2016, France joined the 7 other countries that have followed the 1999 Swedish law that is basically a law that promotes gender equality, recognizing that the institution of prostitution is steeped in systems of gender inequality, socioeconomic inequalities, racial inequalities, immigration inequalities, and that the proper reform is to recognize these systems as harmful and to assist people in prostitution. So an interministerial report was just issued from the government of France about the 2016 law last week. And so, Jonathan, if you could give us some highlights of the trajectory toward the French law, and what does it mean within police reform, and how is the police reacting to the law?
Sure. Thank you, Diana. So yes, actually, we've had this law in 2016 that basically recognizes prostitution as a form of violence. It's interesting, this change of conception, especially if we think about how the police is supposed to interact with the prostituted persons. I will come back to this later. I just want to give a few key figures regarding the implementation of this equality law, because the numbers are actually promising. And what's interesting is that we have before and after data regarding the impact of the equality model in France. So actually, the first figure I want to highlight, and I think it's very important to highlight it, and that we sometimes forget to highlight it enough, is 0. 0 is the amount of prostituted persons that were arrested for prostitution related activities since the law passed. Before the law, in the previous prohibitionist model in France, we had an average of 2,000 people arrested every year. So I think it's interesting to remember this, that when we talk about the law of penalization, actually that's the abolitionists that decriminalized people in prostitution. And I think that's important to remember it. It's also a law that puts protection and rehabilitation of persons involved in prostitution as a priority. So the implementation of exit programs has been progressive. It's becoming to really work right now. We've had almost 400 prostituted persons who had access to an exit program. So this exit program includes residency permit, housing, training, financial and psychosocial support. It's also about justice and about targeting the criminal networks and the pimps. Since we had this law, there was more than 54% of increase of procedures against pimps. That's also an interesting data, because in prohibitionist countries, it can be a belief that if we decriminalize prostituted persons, it will affect the efficacy and the impact of the police investigations, and it's actually not true, as we can see. It's also about justice, actually, because when you target those criminal networks, you get money back, actually. And so more than 2 million euros were confiscated and reinvested in protection and rehabilitation programs for victims of prostitution. So we talk about 7 times more compensations and reparations for victims of prostitution, 7 times more than before when we didn't have this equality model. And of course, to finish, we penalize the client. We penalize the client, and there were 5,000 sex buyers arrested and penalized since this law passed. So I think it's an interesting data we can see, and we see that where the law is implemented, it works, and that's the main result of this evaluation, meaning that we still have to make progress so that the law is implemented everywhere in France. That's something we work on. We have to make progress so that exit programs are more easily accessible, and I mean, we have to make progress on everything, and we are pushing for the state to really allocate resources to the implementation of the model. But the result of the evaluation is that the model works, and we can see that the police does its work in terms of repression for the pimps. Now there is a challenge that we have to face because in an abolitionist system, actually, the protective role of the police is key. And actually, in an abolitionist system, it's the only system where the police is supposed to be enabled, to be empowered in protecting victims of prostitution, because in a prohibitionist system, they will have a repressive role, and in a regulationist system, they will have a de facto, I would say, a kind of complicit role, because they will have to close eyes on the prostitution as a form of violence, because it will be considered as a legal work. So actually, that's where we face difficulties, because the French police is affected by the same plagues than the American police. We've seen in the last years a huge increase, actually, of cases mixing structural racism, classism, sexism, xenophobia in the police, and actually the record of our police in terms of violence is really bad right now. So we are facing the same difficulties, and just before actually the adoption of the abolitionist law, the role of the police regarding people in prostitution was a repressive role. So also it's difficult for the police to be perceived as a few months or a few years ago, they were still supposed to arrest people in prostitution. So that's a challenge. I don't know if you want to address the issue of what kind of reforms we could try to encourage, or maybe we have to talk about it later. I can also stop now.
Sure, we can definitely come back to it later. Thank you so much for the presentation, the synopsis of this recent government evaluation. You know, the challenges that we face are enormous, but those of us who have been working on issues of women and girls' rights for a long time see this whole conversation around commercial sexual exploitation and the sex trade as very similar to the conversations that grassroots women's groups have had for millennia on domestic violence, on sexual violence, on rape. How do you educate the police? And we have to remember that the police are just a reflection of our society, right? They are made of individuals, mostly men, who have grown up in the same harmful practices against women and girls, and with always turning a blind eye to the violence and degradation and dehumanization that women and girls face. But I would like now to go back to sort of the challenges that all of our countries face right now, and that is even within our own social justice movements that are that have, I would say, cognitive dissonance between looking at police reform or actually pushing for human rights and equality for all, and yet accepting the system of prostitution as a form of violence. And in particular, in the US now, what we are seeing is this movement that is promoting the legalization and decriminalization of the sex trade, including sex buying, pimping, brothel owning. They're pushing Black and brown trans women as their spokespeople for decriminalization, when in fact, and I'd like Melanie, both Melanie and Yasmin to talk about this, when in fact, we are talking about the violation, desecration, violence, and even murder of Black feminized bodies and brown feminized bodies perpetrated, right? Because it's always invisible who is doing the harm, by mostly sex buyers and exploiters. So Melanie, would you like to address this, this dichotomy that we're facing?
Sure, absolutely. So it's definitely a difficult one. And I think that speaking to the fact that Black and brown trans folks are being pushed to highlight this agenda, I think that there's this huge misconception in society about why or how prostitution should be fully decriminalized. And I think that a lot of people are miseducated about this issue and are jumping on this bandwagon because it's the only way that they feel like they know how to support Black and brown trans folks, because otherwise they don't know about the issue. Most of them aren't survivors or haven't heard about prostitution, or still think that prostitution is an issue that only happens in underdeveloped countries. And I think that the reason that our Black and brown trans folks are so adamant about pushing this full decriminalization agenda is because they are a highly discriminated against, marginalized community that has otherwise been ostracized from other communities and being accepted. So I think that because prostitution is this enterprise that welcomes and targets the marginalized, impoverished, most vulnerable people, that's the only place where they have found quote unquote community, that when they were homeless or when they were kicked out or when they were discriminated against, that's the only enterprise and the only place that trans folks could go that is willing to take them and targets them for their vulnerability. So of course, when you are growing up, for lack of a better term, when you're growing up in a system that is geared to and targeted against you, and literally preys on the fact that you have no other resources, then of course, if this is all you know, you're gonna fully support that and say that that is your lifestyle. And as a survivor myself, I can attest to the fact that the only way that you can mentally get through constant rape and continuous paid rape is to tell yourself that you are in control of that situation. Many people, nobody, in my opinion, nobody wakes up one day and says, I want to be in prostitution. So the fact that they have grown to accept, or maybe just grown to accept this understanding that prostitution is what's best for them and what's best for the youth of the future, it comes from this lack of understanding that there are other options out there. It comes from the fact that when they've tried to seek out other resources, they've been discriminated against. So of course, if prostitution is welcoming you with open arms, you're going to say that you're going to call that home, you're going to call that family. And I think that right now, I mean, they've been pushing this full decriminalization agenda for a few years now, but I think it's been heightened and emphasized in this Black Lives Matter movement because of what we're seeing with police brutality against Black and brown bodies. And I think that the full decriminalization movement and the lobby for that is using this and taking advantage of this as an opportunity to push that agenda. And I think that a lot of people don't know that there is this partial decriminalization agenda. A lot of people don't know that there's this third way. A lot of people only hear about either full decriminalization or full legalization or criminalization. They're not hearing that there is this model in which we support where we can decriminalize the person who's being prostituted or exploited and still hold accountable perpetrators, pimps, sex buyers, and traffickers, etc. And I think that there's not enough conversation being had about this alternative. We need to talk about the fact, and I want to emphasize and uplift what Jonathan was just saying about these exit programs for survivors. And this goes back to my point that I was talking about earlier when it comes to defunding the police department and reinvesting those monies back into the community. The reason why many of us survivors are struggling right now is because we come from a lack of resources in the first place, which is the reason why many of us get thrown into prostitution, because we have no other options or any other outlets. And I think that if we take these monies back, it's not just about defunding the police department because we want to. It's about reinvesting in the communities that need the help in the first place so that we don't get reintegrated into prostitution in the near future. And I think that if we could find a way to find the intersection of defunding the police department and highlighting internalized racism, while still keeping in mind that women and girls, especially Black women and girls, are being the most targeted and the most vulnerable in these populations, I think we need to find this intersection in order for us to continue to build a world where women and girls and Black individuals who are exploited are at the top of the standard, while at the same time still highlighting the injustices by the police. So I think it's still a very complex and confusing conversation, and I don't think that any of us, especially now, have the answers for that. But I think that while we're trying to figure out what those answers are, we need to bear this in mind, because oftentimes when we're talking about police reform, we're leaving Black women and girls and exploited people out of the conversation. And we're not taking into account, we're in this radical push because we're angry and our adrenaline is riled up, and we're not talking about, we're saying defund everything, get rid of them entirely. And I understand why we need to get rid of them, but we're not bearing in mind what's happening to those who are exploited while we're taking away. Because even as we're having this conversation right now, somebody's getting exploited. And we're not talking about that. We need to focus on that and focus on how we're going to help sustain them and those individuals while still finding the crux of this. So I think that we need to continue having more conversations about that and bear in mind why Black and brown trans folks are being pushed to fully decriminalize prostitution. We need to focus on not what exactly they're saying, but why they're saying it. And I think that if we shift our mindsets to focus on that, then we'll recognize that it's not coming from a place of just wanting to decriminalize prostitution. It's coming because they've had a lack of resources and have been discriminated against their whole life, and this is all that they know. So I think we need to start asking ourselves some more questions beyond what we hear on the surface and in the media.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Melanie. And before I give the floor to Yasmin, I just wanted to add some other level of cognitive dissonance, or perhaps indifference to the plight of Black women and girls in particular, is the case of Toyin Salau, a 19-year-old Black Lives Matter activist who was raped and murdered by a Black man, and the level of outrage that should have arisen from this very young woman's rape and murder has been totally sidelined by the people who are supposed to be with us in fighting for social justice and social revolution.
I mean, absolutely, and I just completely echo everything that Melanie just said so beautifully. I think, the case of Toyin is really, really powerful example of, it just highlights all of the complexities that we're dealing with right now. And I think that's a big reason why we haven't necessarily heard the level of outrage or an articulation of what a vision, a reimagination of safety and justice for Black women and girls and, women and girls of color could look like, right? It definitely throws a wrench in a lot of the very provocative and attractive talking points. But, I do think it's important to just note that I don't necessarily think that, concepts of prison and police abolition are incompatible with our goals of sex trade abolition, right? Why is it that we as individuals who are determined to abolish the sex trade, why is it that we are unsatisfied with mere harm reduction approaches? It's because we understand that it's not enough to reform oppressive systems, right? We have to eradicate them. We have to dismantle them entirely. What I think is interesting and what's been difficult is that the failure to recognize that in many ways, the prison system is the counterpart to the sex trade for Black men and boys. right? These are racist, violent, sexist systems of oppression rooted in slavery, rooted in genocide. And so it makes sense to me that activists today are unsatisfied with the reform that has taken place, that has not been able to turn around meaningful structural change, and that they want to abolish the system altogether. What I think is important is just hitting everything that Mel said. We need to ensure, as victim advocates, as women's rights advocates, as racial justice advocates, as child rights advocates, that in re-envisioning and reimagining what safety and accountability look like, that we are centering the needs of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And in this situation, we are talking about Black women and girls and children, and that includes gender expansive LGBT folks, and making sure that they are safe and have meaningful accountability measures in whatever this new an alternative mechanism for safety and accountability looks like, whether that has elements of community policing, as Mel talked about, whether it is, community accountability, whether there's elements of restorative or transformative justice. We just have to make sure that we are not leaving behind girls like Toyin, right? That we are understanding and hearing young women and girls, and particularly Black girls, when they're telling us we don't feel safe even in our own communities. And I know that's can be said for many other communities of color and marginalized communities, but it's a conversation that we're having right now locally in DC. We are one of the founders of the DC Girls Coalition, and I'll say that it came up at one of our recent meetings where young girls, and again, we're talking about virtually, all Black girls, we're talking about how they don't feel safe when they go to the protests, and they want to figure out some other type of safety and accountability mechanism outside of our current system, because they understand the fraught history of policing in this country and of the criminal justice system. And so, it's our responsibility to hear those voices and elevate them, not silence them because they're inconvenient to the overall momentum that's happening right now. So I think it's been very disappointing to see the few Black women that have courageously raised these contradictions and these failures and oversights have really been eviscerated in social media and in the media. They're basically being silenced and told to continue to subordinate their well-being and safety to that of male liberation, right? And so it's something that many of us from communities of color have been told and have internalized over the years. And so I think it's our responsibility to center those voices, and whatever this accountability mechanism looks like, we need to make sure that women and girls, and Black women and girls and children, are not being left behind, or unfortunately we risk subbing out one inadequate and harmful system for another.
Yes, thank you. That is my brother's keeper syndrome. So bringing it back to the international level, Per-Anders and Jonathan, we have about 5 minutes before we go to the Q&A segment. A lot of this conversation has not really focused on the money. In our work, in our international work, we understand that very, very influential funders are behind this whole movement to decriminalize the entire sex trade, including pimping and brothel owning. On the positive side, 7 countries have followed Sweden in its recognition that the system of prostitution is a form of violence. Not one country has followed the full decriminalization model, that is New Zealand. The Spotlight Initiative is a European Union funding initiative that is supposedly dedicated to the empowerment and looking at issues of women and girls globally. Unfortunately, a number of the funders are funders who have who are basically financing the global movement to decriminalize the sex trade. And so do you have, since each of your countries and your colleagues have been in the trenches on these issues, can you give us hope as to how to counteract this this very neo-colonialist approach to keep women and girls and trans women and trans youth on the marketplace of sex? Jonathan, you want to start? Or Per-Anders, you want to start?
Yes. Well, regarding the donors' policies, I think it's a fundamental question, and I think our priority should be to plainly tell to the aid agencies of the abolitionist countries to stick to their domestic policies. Meaning that actually it's really painful, to be honest, and really surprising to see that most of the aid agencies of the abolitionist countries support pro-prostitution or pro-sex work, as they call themselves, organizations in other countries. So you actually have an abolitionist agenda and policy that is implemented in the country. But when you go in southern countries specifically, where NGOs have a lot of power, a lot of leverage actually, then that's the pro-prostitution agendas that are implemented. And so I think this is an effort that we must initiate and really, I mean, we have to push for it, to go to talk to those aid agencies and to tell them, well, I mean, you have to have some coherence, you know, between your domestic policies and the initiatives you are supporting abroad. So just what I have to say in terms of donors. I see we don't have a lot of time, but I think it's an essential move we have to undertake.
Thank you, Jonathan. Panelists, do you have anything to add?
Thank you. Yes, I do. I mean, there's no secret that Sweden is against prostitution, and there's no secret that Sweden also is funding organizations like Mama Cash who are working for the pro-sex work, pro-sex movement, so to say. And this is, of course, a problem, and we've had this discussion within the Swedish government. And of course, our foreign aid should never go to something that is against the Swedish law. And therefore, there is a clausule in the agreement with those organizations that they cannot use any of the funding from the Swedish government for doing exactly promoting sex work. But it is said that they are doing other things that are very valuable, and they can use the money for that. But this is an ongoing discussion, and I agree with Jonathan that this is problematic in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes, maybe 15 for Q&A, and so Mariana will help us sifting those questions. Thank you for sending them.
Absolutely, and thank you everyone, to all the panelists and to our attendees for sending these questions. So 2 very similar questions, but first for Jonathan and for Ambassador Sunesson, in both of your countries, how are the police dealing with the change of viewing women as in prostitution as victims rather than criminals? Since each of your laws were passed, who provides the training they need to come to this understanding, and how central is that training to their core training as part of the law enforcement? Parenders, if you want to take it first.
Have you unmuted me?
Yes, I have.
Okay, great. So yes, when the law was passed back in 1999, there was not a full support from the police organization or from prosecutors or from the judges. There were different views on this. So there was a lot of information invested and a lot of training of police officers invested into this to make them understand the legislation and the reason behind the legislation with the gender equality and everything. And today there is, I would say there's 100% support among police law enforcement agencies that this law is actually good. And when I was appointed, I went out working with some police officers in Stockholm a couple of nights just to see how they were working on this topic. And we had this discussion, and they said, you know, Anders, first we thought this was very strange just to arrest the Johns and not the ones who are selling sex. But today we find this legislation excellent. Problem talking to those who are in prostitution, they are not afraid of us and so on. So I would say that with time, with the investment of information and training, and seeing the facts that this is really the right way to go, there's not a discussion with police officers today. Thank you.
Okay.
Jonathan?
Yes, thanks. Well, honestly, in France, where we have issues with the police, we have actually. I mean, I cannot say even more than about prostitution. The implementation and protection of women's rights in general by the French police has been problematic for the recent years. What I can say is that in the evaluation report, it is clear that there is training regarding pimping and proxenetism and trafficking, especially for the directions of the police, for the officials. But one of the recommendations of the report is to generalize this training to all policemen, and also to generalize the training to a psychotraumatic approach to victims' identification, and to have a more comprehensive and more sensitive approach to people in prostitution. It's challenging, to be honest, because we have a police that is voting at more than 50% for the far-right parties, who have a racist and sexist agenda. So when we see who are the people who are in prostitution in France, it's of course mostly women, mostly foreign women, women of color. So, I mean, when you have those people supposed to protect those kind of groups, well, we have to work on it. So actually, we have the first thing for us, and honestly, when I hear what is the revendications in the US, I'm a kind of ashamed, because in France we are so far from those kind of revendications. In France, it would already be incredible to have just an independent organism that investigates on police officers' action. Right now, that's policemen that are investigating on other policemen, and the level of impunity is incredible. So we should develop training, we should implement training, but I think what we need is to end impunity. It's to have an independent body that really evaluates the action of the police, and also, honestly, to have a look of on who is worthy of the uniform and who is not at some point. I mean, I honestly don't think that a training can turn a racist and sexist policeman into an anti-sexist and anti-racist policeman. I think those people shouldn't be in the police, period. And for the other ones, yes, we should train them on how to have a better approach. But yes, it's a complicated situation, and especially since, as I said, in an abolitionist model, the protective role of the police is key. So yeah, we have to work on it, and we're working on it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Connected to this question, but for Melanie and Yasmin, can you both speak to the impact or effectiveness, if any, of SVU or anti-trafficking units within police departments in the US today, and about what kind of reforms, what kind of changes you would like to see happen to tackle the issues that you've all been bringing up?
So I'm happy to go first. I think, like Jonathan was saying, the whole institution of policing in the United States is very fraught. We haven't worked with a single sex trade survivor who has not experienced violence or exploitation at the hands of the police. And then, of course, we know how, marginalized communities and communities of color have a very fraught and mistrusting relationship with the police. I think it's important to understand, the history of policing in the United States. The fact that this is an institution that derived from slave patrols, right, were one of their main functions. And so, the lack of overall training that's required in the United States, right? So to become a cop. So I think, also as Jonathan said, like, I don't think the answer is investing more money in funding and training, because I agree. I think that's there's no evidence that that's working. But I do think that there are a number of key steps that we could take in the meantime to help promote accountability and end impunity. And so some of the recommendations that we have provided locally when our city council was considering a full decriminalization bill, and then as well as nationally for others to consider, are making sure that we are instituting meaningful accountability measures for police officers. I think an independent citizen review board is a great example of how we can do that. Making sure that we are holding bad actor, abusive police officers accountable, and making sure that they're not able to be rehired. And then instituting, a number of reforms outside of the system, right? Making sure that we end the criminalization of individuals in the sex trade, that we clear and expunge their records, right? With or without regard to the fact that they can show that they were trafficked. I think just if we recognize prostitution as a form of violence against women, then we should not allow people to carry criminal records, on their history that are, continuing to hinder their opportunity to access meaningful resources. And so, those are some of the things and steps that I think we can take in the interim. But, I would caution against, increasing law enforcement funding for training around sexual violence or implicit bias, or, they don't think they're biased. And we find that these funds are really wasted in many ways, that they just add to an already inflated police budget, and that they could be better used, as Melanie said, for reinvesting in the community, for services, resources, exit strategies for sex trade survivors, and other community supports to ideally prevent individuals from being so vulnerable that they enter the sex trade to begin with, right? So I think these are the types of things that we should be looking at. But it's a very difficult question, and one that I think is incredibly complicated in the United States, because we have a country that just refuses to acknowledge and grapple with its very problematic history of white supremacy, slavery, and colonization. And until we grapple with that reality, there's no way that we can entrust these systems to protect our people.
Just to add, I feel as though maybe my perspective is a little slighted. So as I mentioned a little while ago, I have encountered the police on many different occasions. And one of those occasions being that many police officers are sex buyers, and they abuse that position of authority and that power to actually become some of the more violent sex buyers, because they know they can get away with it. In my experience, the first time that I was arrested, it was by a department that was not SVU, and I was terribly mistreated by that department. And I'll say that hours later, when SVU arrived, they were a little bit softer with me than the department that I was arrested by. But however, with that being said, they are still police officers, and I agree with Yasmin that I think we're just wasting more dollars on trying to incorporate more trainings. But if in this capitalist society, if the trainings are going to continue and be necessary, I think that we need to reevaluate who are training these people. Because if you're being trained, if SVU specifically is being trained by watching Law and Order, and we're talking about these extreme cases of children, and we're not focusing on what modern prostitution looks like, if we're not focusing on who's being exploited and why they're being exploited, if you have one generalist training to what prostitution looked like at a certain time years ago, if we're not talking about how prostitution is consistently being elevated and innovative, especially like online, things like that, you're not keeping up to times of what the hell is going on, pardon my French, but because of that, now we continue to suffer. And I think that what I'm noticing, in addition to the fact that police officers and the police department in its entirety was built on slavery and racism and all of these internalized misogynistic and sexist values, we're also not taking into account that there are no sex trade survivors that are in these trainings. They're not incorporated in these trainings. They're not the ones that are training the police. So in addition to the police department being trained to automatically see Black and brown, which already constitutes to a whole myriad of issues when it comes to Black and brown bodies, they're also not taking into account that we make up the most marginalized, especially within the sex trade. So if you're already being, if they're already being trained to see us in a negative light, and then they're not incorporating the fact that they already see people in prostitution as criminals, then they're not having the proper understanding of what we look like and what we're going through. So they're going to continue to abuse their power and authority. And I think that, like Yasmin said, it's a difficult question. We don't have the answers right now, but we do need to focus on what's wrong with the system so that we could eradicate and omit that, and then figure out what solution needs to be put in place. Because right now, the training that they have isn't working. People are still getting prostituted. People are still getting kidnapped and exploited. And there's a reason why our system is not being helpful in this way. So we need to really figure out what those intersections are, what the issues are, erase those systems and those intersections and those problems, and then figure out what the solution is. And it cannot be continuing to do what we've already been doing, because it hasn't worked.
Yeah, and just to quickly just piggyback off that, just to end on a positive note, I mean, I can say that in DC, one promising example of this has been the great work that Tina Front and Courtney's House have been doing, and really just a testament to the level of amazing work and respect that Tina has garnered in our community, where they have been able to actually provide a specialized training to the children's division of a local anti-trafficking task force. And so they have found some success there, right? But it continues to be a battle because of the structure of law enforcement, the fact of the high turnover, the rotation of officers in and out of units. And so, you know, training can't be what we ultimately rely on, but, you know, I think the ultimate point is we have to be mindful of how survivors and young women and girls of color in particular are being impacted in the interim as we make reforms, as we move to you know, different or more radical systems of accountability. We just have to make sure that young women and girls of color, and particularly Black women and girls, are not being left behind. So that requires co-creating, right? Systems of safety with them, engaging them in these conversations, and providing the platform to hear directly from the community in which is going to be directly impacted. So I think that that's key to reshaping any of these policies.
So we have reached the 1 hour target. The questions are coming in. There are many of them. They're all brilliant questions. We will continue, I guess, for another 15 minutes for those who can stay on. I see a question, is prostitution femicide? And the quick answer to that would be yes, it is a form of femicide. We will never know how many women have died at the hands of sex buyers or as a result of prostitution or from violence and murder of their pimps and traffickers. However, we have a vibrant survivor leadership movement afoot globally, in the global north and the global south and the east and the west. I would like to remind you that CATW has a Survivor Leadership Fund. If you have a few dollars to spare, please donate to that fund so that we can continue making sure that the survivors of the sex trade are at every single policy making and legislative thinking table in the United States and around the world. For those who are leaving us, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank our extraordinary speakers. I wish we could all bottle you and you in every jurisdiction of the world, and thank you for your work. So I will If you can stay for another 10 minutes, Mariana will continue asking questions that are coming in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taina. And if anyone has any other questions that they haven't been able to ask and you are leaving, please just contact us at info@catwinternational.org. We'll be happy to try and answer it or connect you with our panelists. So to continue, to all of you, why do you think that there's so much resistance to holding perpetrators accountable? Why is there so much conversation around this full decriminalization idea and the perpetrators get erased from the conversation?
Personally, I think because many of the people that are put in positions to hold the perpetrators accountable are part of the perpetrators. So of course, if you are a sex buyer yourself, if you're a pimp yourself, but you're also a cop and you're the person that's responsible for holding these people accountable, you're going to be hesitant because you know that you're included in that population. And again, going back to Taina's point, misogyny and sexism are so deeply rooted and ingrained in our society. It's hard. A lot of people are looking at this and saying, oh, you know, cops are not taking this into account, et cetera, but they're also not recognizing that, like Taina was saying, women are left out of this conversation, which is why if you look at BLM as we're talking about it now, there was so much outrage for George Floyd and not the same amount of outrage for Breonna Taylor and Toyin, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to focus on the fact that half of these perps are people that are supposed to be holding perps accountable, as well as this deeply enrooted misogyny and sexism that goes back centuries beyond my years, at least. And we're not talking about how that translates into how people, especially those with positions of authority, how that translates into them not holding and upholding these accountabilities.
Can I jump in on this one?
Yes, please.
Okay, I would echo what Melanie said. Money and patriarchy, men's power over women, that's for sure one of the major reasons. But there's also a very troublesome discussion when it comes to human rights. I invited a huge human rights organization to my office about 6 months ago because they were out in media saying that we are telling the South African government that they should decriminalize both buying and selling. So I called them and I said, could we meet and we can have this discussion so you can make me understand your arguments? So we met for an hour and we talked and I gave them all my arguments why prostitution is not a job, why prostitution is exploitation, and why those who are in prostitution should not be punished, and why we should criminalize the buyers to stop demand. And they agreed on everything I said. So at the end of the hour, I was like, okay, so how come you recommend South African government to do this? And the answer I got was just one reason. We do not want to recommend something that means that these poor women cannot make a living. And for me, that is such a strange thing for a human rights organization to say. I mean, human rights are universal. They apply to everyone, not only the rich ones. And a human rights organization should be arguing for a decent job, not give legitimacy to countries to not protect the most vulnerable. Thanks.
Does anyone else want to jump in? All right. So in terms of how those supporting full decriminalization claim that partial decriminalization is more violent, can make the commercial sex trade more violent and more dangerous. One of our attendees is very confused by this argument. Do you all have something to say about that?
So I don't understand how somebody can see us trying to get rid of perpetrators, yet support those who have been exploited as confusing. And I'm not speaking to the attendee, I'm talking about those individuals who are claiming that partial decrim is negative. And I think that this goes back to what I was saying earlier about when you are somebody who has been ostracized from every other community, yet have only been 125% accepted by a community that's set to target you, of course you're going to see that community or that enterprise as accepting, as family. And again, in order to get through day-to-day continuous paid rape and to constantly go through having somebody buy you over and over again, mentally you have to tell yourself that you are in control of the situation. There is no way, and we've seen this in Per Anders' country, we've seen this in Jonathan's country, we've seen this in other countries who have implemented the Nordic or equality model, positive impacts and nothing but success rates and decreased rates of violence against women in prostitution with this implementation of this model. There isn't in any way that taking a person that's been looked at as a criminal when they've been a victim, there's no way in allocating resources and funding to that individual. There's no way that arresting pimps and sex buyers who perpetrate this, there's no way that that could possibly be harmful. If anything, we're trying to remove the person that's been stigmatized and ostracized this entire time. We're trying to remove them from a negative situation and do nothing but provide them with the resources they never had in the first place. Give them exit strategies, give them therapy, give them jobs back, all of these different things that make us vulnerable and make us the target for prostitution. So again, when you are somebody who has not seen anything any other way, when you're somebody who comes from a lack of resource, of course, this is going to seem like your only option. But when there's a strategy, partial decrim, specifically, when this is something that is trying to give you the tools that you didn't have in the first place, it can only be positive and successful, which is why I highly support that.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, I think that's just a very disingenuous argument. I think it's just one of the provocative talking points that the pro lobby has been throwing around for years. But I mean, if we just think about it sensibly, partial decriminalization merely decriminalizes the act of selling sex directly, right? So protects the prostituted person from arrest and prosecution. It maintains the current legal prohibitions against purchasing sex, brothel keeping, facilitation. So how does maintaining the status quo with respect to these other exploitive behaviors increase violence? So basically they're arguing that by decriminalizing survivors, you're increasing, by keeping everything else the same, we're increasing violence. So I just think it's a very disingenuous argument, and one that's, fear-mongering around, just trying to find excuses to trash the partial decriminalization framework, which is the survivor-centered framework.
Please, Jonathan.
Yes. Anyway, I think they are just not into facts and data, honestly. I mean, in France, we've been in a kind of defensive mode for 4 years now, and since the law passed, and we heard, almost every month a new kind of argument that had no rationality, but that was. That was just used to try to demean the law. Actually, I think what we can observe is that most of the time the pro-prostitution lobby spends is not at helping and supporting victims of prostitution, because actually that's the abolitionist field work organizations that do it. But most of the time they spend it at doing entryism and infiltrating related progressist movements. Like if you go today on the Strasse, it's the French so-called union for sex workers. The name of their organization on their Twitter account is /Black Lives Matter. They're at this level of entryism. And if you go on a protest for workers' rights, you will have them, even if they are supporting merchandising the body, and that they are funded by the worst billionaires on earth, they will tell they are anti-capitalist. And the months after, if you have a protest for the environment, you will also find them with, supporting an action of Extinction Rebellion. And I think it has a big impact, actually, because by being constantly in this kind of marketing operation, by being constantly on the side of those groups, they start to have a positive image, actually, in the progressist circles that do not even question the real ideology. It's just that by being constantly with them, I think they get a positive aura. And when you talk to people that frequent them but don't really know them, and you start to go at the bottom of the question, they have no real arguments. But it's just a permanent marketing mode. So just what I wanted to say, because I just saw the Strass/Black Twitter account yesterday, and it drove me crazy.
Thank you, Jonathan. Does anyone want to add anything else? If not, I'll turn it back to Taina.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for those who stayed an extra 15 minutes to hear these absolutely brilliant and on target answers. I am so proud to be your partners in this very, very difficult war, I should say. But we know that eventually the voices of survivors will reach the highest levels of government and policymaking, and we will win. So stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy. Thank you, Melanie, Yasmin, Per-Anders, and Jonathan. And thank you to my amazing staff, Mariana, Laura, Meredith, for making this possible today. Thanks to all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. That's it for us for our third At the Edge of the Margins webinar. Again, if you have any questions for CatW or for any of our panelists, please email us at info@catwinternational.org. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, all over the world.
Thank you.